Today we're going to be talking about the end of the Cold War. By the end of this video, you should be able to explain what detente was. You should be able to describe the strategy pursued by Ronald Reagan toward the end of the Cold War. You should be able to describe the reforms put in place by Gorbachev and what the results of these reforms were. And you should be able to briefly describe what has happened in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. We last left the United States and the USSR at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis was probably the closest the United States and the USSR had come to starting a nuclear war with each other. And because of this, both sides realized that they needed to reduce tensions between them, otherwise it could result in the end of the world. So these more peaceful relations that were pursued fell under the name of detente. And so the 1970s were basically an era where the United States and the Soviet Union kind of backed down and took measures to form trust. So even though they were opposed to each other, they wanted to form some bonds that would keep them from going to direct war and prevent them from blowing up the world. And this lasts throughout the 70s. But at the end of the 1970s, some events cause a renewal of tension between the United States and the USSR. What prompts this is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Basically, the Soviet Union had a puppet state set up in Afghanistan, and this had been overthrown by a military coup, so they intervened militarily in order to prop up a new communist government there. Fairly similar to what the United States had been doing in Vietnam and Korea, was basically trying to keep a government that was loyal to them from falling into the enemy camp. So as a result of this, the United States condemns the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as an attempt to spread communism, which it doesn't like. And in response, the United States boycotts the Moscow 1980s Olympics and calls on other nations to do so as well, condemning Soviet action. This is the atmosphere in which Ronald Reagan is able to become president. Ronald Reagan was a conservative leader in the United States who made opposing the Soviet Union central to his policy. And he was very popular for this and for other reasons as well. So Ronald Reagan didn't mince words. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he made very clear demands to the Soviet Union as to what it should do. For example, he declared one time in the mid-80s that the Soviet Union should tear down the Berlin Wall, which was seen as a sign of oppression. On top of this, he decided to renew the arms race, so he abandoned the U.S. policy of detente and started amping up U.S. military spending. His idea was that by spending a lot of money on military, he was going to force the Soviet Union to spend a lot of money on the military as well. And he believed that the Soviet Union would ultimately be unable to cope with competing with the United States, that it would eventually go bankrupt trying to compete with the U.S. The capstone of Ronald Reagan's new military policy was something known as Star Wars, also known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. So this was an idea for the United States to regain nuclear supremacy in the world, which basically involved building satellites that would use laser beams or particle beams to shoot down enemy nuclear missiles. This idea, most people believe now to be fairly impossible, especially with 1980s technology, but just the mere threat that the United States had this kind of technology and had the money to finance such a project scared the Soviet Union and led them to amp up their own military spending. On top of these changes that were going on in U.S. relations to the Soviet Union, there was a lot of change going on in the Soviet Union as well. So during the era of detente, the guy who was in charge was Leonid Brezhnev. And he basically was a conservative leader who relied on repressive rule to keep control. He didn't want the Soviet Union to change. He kind of stuck with the model as it had worked so far, which was centralized economics and totalitarian measures to maintain order. There were several uprisings in Eastern Europe, most notably in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1969, that demanded greater individual rights and democracy. Brezhnev responded to these by sending in tanks and crushing the rebels violently. And in this way, he was able to maintain control of Eastern Europe. This all began to change, though, as the Soviet Union, basically the old generation of Soviet Union rulers, people who had been alive when Stalin was around, died off. And a new generation of Soviet rulers took over, and they had more progressive ideas for how the Soviet Union should compete with the United States. And the guy who ends up in control of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, basically believes in these things. He believes in changing the Soviet Union to make it stronger and more competitive. And his two main policies are known as perestroika, which means restructuring, and glasnost, which means openness. And so perestroika was Gorbachev's idea to make the Soviet economy more competitive and stronger. And his basic idea was to introduce a little bit of free market economics into the Soviet economy, so that way it would be able to compete with US and Western European economies. The idea of glasnost was involved increasing openness in the Soviet government, so Soviet citizens would know what the Soviet government was doing. And he wanted to allow greater freedom of speech. People could criticize the Soviet Union and come up with new ideas and stuff like that. And last of all, Gorbachev believed that the Soviet Union should loosen its grasp on Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and basically allow these countries to do what they wanted rather than forcing them to remain with the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is widely celebrated in the United States, but basically he is a failure. His goal was to make the USSR stronger by passing liberal reforms. But what actually happens is Gorbachev's liberal reforms set off a chain reaction that ends with the implosion of the Soviet Union. So, as part of his loosening grasp on Eastern Europe, there are a number of democratic movements that grow up there, especially in Poland and Czechoslovakia. And Gorbachev allows these democratic movements to hold elections, and the elections proceed. And in these elections, the Communist Party is defeated badly. And so these countries become democracies and try to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. And basically this represents a breakdown of Soviet authority, and all across the Soviet Union, different national groups try to break away and form their own democratic governments. Reacting to this, a number of conservatives within Gorbachev's government decide to stage a coup in which they will take Gorbachev captive and return to old iron-fisted measures using Soviet military power to keep the satellite states in check. But pro-democratic forces in Russia, led by Boris Yeltsin, who you see there, are able to thwart this coup. And they actually stand up to Soviet military power and force the government to stand down. As a result of this, the Soviet Union crumbles, and Russia emerges as a democracy in 1991. There's Boris Yeltsin there, very pleased with himself. So that is the end of the Soviet Union, and American scholars today argue about exactly how this happened. Some people in the United States believe that the collapse of the USSR was caused primarily by competition with the US. Basically that the people in the Soviet Union desired Western lifestyles and Western freedoms and Western consumer products, or that the Soviet Union, because of its inefficient economic system, was unable to compete with Ronald Reagan's new arms race. Other Others believed that the primary cause for the collapse of the USSR was due to internal factors. Some historians have argued convincingly that it was because of the drop of oil prices in the 1980s that the Soviet Union was no longer able to maintain its military stranglehold on Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Others believe that it was primarily because of Gorbachev's reforms that the Soviet Union collapsed, due to this chain reaction of democratic movements leading to the breakdown of the old Soviet order. Russia's history since the Cold War has been pretty interesting, and I just want to give you guys a quick glimpse that will bring you right up to today. So after the Soviet Union collapses, the United States remains as the world's single superpower. And basically what the United States tries to do after this is to spread American influence and ideals throughout the world. Basically, the United States believes that now that communism is gone, everybody in the world will accept American ideas of democracy and capitalism and international free trade. And so they try to spread this in a number of ways. On top of this, the United States asserts its military control throughout the world by establishing and maintaining military bases all over the place. Russia from 1991 to 2000 is basically a cooperative partner in the United States' New World Order. They remain a fairly competitive democracy, and they cooperate with the United States and Europe on international issues. Basically, people think that Russia is now a Western-style democracy. And they also convert to capitalism very, very quickly in something called by Yeltsin shock therapy, where they basically switch from being a communist economy to a capitalist economy overnight, which was not very good for the Russian economy and resulted in widespread inequality. But then comes Vladimir Putin, who has basically been in charge of Russia since the year 2000. And Putin took steps to gradually eliminate fair democratic elections, and now his political party is basically the only one that can win elections. Putin now views Russia as being in conflict with the United States, and he seeks to reclaim lost Soviet territory in both Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He also seeks to fight US and European influence in a region that he sees as belonging historically to Russia. And so Putin's strategy has basically involved using economic and military power to assert Russian power in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and this has resulted in two wars, one in the Caucasian state of Georgia in 2006, and another one that is currently ongoing in Ukraine. In both of these cases, he is attempting to reassert Russian control in an area that was originally controlled by the Soviet Union. So that brings us up to today. I will tell you more history about Russia, or I would, but there is no more. Of course, there are lots and lots of details that I've left out, but that's enough for today. I will see you all tomorrow.